In this video, I will cover a topic called quadratic equations. The first thing that we need to know is what is a quadratic equation. So a quadratic equation is an equation that has a form y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Any equation that has this form y equals ax squared plus bx plus c is called quadratic equation. Now the graph of the quadratic equation will have a particular shape, and that shape will be determined by the value of a. If the value of a is positive, then the graph will have a shape like U, or I can say smiley face. If the value of a is negative, then the graph will have a shape like this. We can say sad face. On this topic, you may be asked a variety of questions in exam. They may ask you to sketch a graph of quadratic equation. They may ask you to factorize a quadratic equation, or they may ask you to solve a given quadratic equation. So let us first consider how do we factorize a quadratic equation. Now, instead of using the generalized formula, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a question, and my question says I have to factorize 2x squared minus 9x plus 10. Now, there are a number of steps which you have to memorize, and the first thing that you will do is step 1. You will say, I'll multiply two numbers and I get something out of it. What is it that I need to get? Is the product of them two. So in this case, when I multiply them two, there's a plus before this 2. So that will give me plus 20x squared. Then the second bit is, when same two numbers are added together, they must give me this minus 9x. Step 2 will be, you will pick up this number from here, excluding a sign, and you will write it down as product of its vectors. So let's quickly factorize that 20. I can say it is divisible by 2, so 2 times 10 gives me 20. I can divide this 10 by 2 again, that gives me 5. I can't divide this 5 by any other number other than 5 and 1. So let's divide it by 5. That gives me 1. So this means 20 can be written as 2 times 2 times 5 times 1. From here, we can now make combinations for this 20. So I can say it could be 2 times 10 gives me 20. I can say 4 times 5 gives me 20. I can say 20 times 1 is also 20. Now once I've done this, what I now need to do is I need to pick up a set of numbers, either the first one, second set, or the third one, to determine values for this section. And this will be my step 3. So let's quickly have a look. If I add 2 and 10, does that give me 9? It doesn't give me 9, so I'm not going to use that. If you add them, that gives you 12. If you subtract them, that gives you 8. None of them is 9, so I can't use this one. How about this one? If I add 5 and 4, that gives me 9. If I subtract them, that gives me 1. So I can say in this case, this one works for us, and I'm going to use 4 and 5. We are going to use 4 and 5. Be careful and make sure when you use 4 and 5 here, you write down letter x next to them as well. Because sometimes these equations will be given in the form of, let's say, 2x squared y squared minus 9xy. In that case, it will be 4xy and 5xy. Now I need to modify these two numbers such that when I add them, they should give me minus 9x. So in this case, I can say I'll make it minus 4x, I'll make it minus 5x. Now you will notice when you multiply them two numbers, that gives you plus 20. So I can write that down here, minus 4x and minus 5x. I'm done with step 2 and step 3. My step 4 will be replacing this minus 9x with these two numbers. So my step 4, I'm repeating it once more. My step 4 is replacing minus 9x with these two numbers. So I can rewrite this equation here, and I'm going to say this is now 2x squared minus 4x minus 5x plus 10 equals 0. So if you look at it, I've replaced this minus 9x with minus 4x and minus 5x. This is my step 4. Once you've done this, then the remaining bits are easy. You will consider the first two terms separately and the last two terms separately. Let's get rid of this 0 from here because it was never there. Now if you look at them two numbers here, you will see 2x squared and minus 4x, they are both divisible by 2x. So I can take 2x out. If I divide this number by 2x, I will be left with x. If I divide minus 4x by 2x, I'll be left with just minus 2. Whatever you've got here, we'll rewrite it here. And now you will need to find something here such that when you multiply this number with x, it should give you minus 5x. I'm repeating it once more. You need to find a number here such that when you multiply it with x, it should give you minus 5x. So I can say in this case, it will be minus 5. Make sure you always put sign here. Sometimes it will be a plus number. In this case, it is minus 5. Once you got that, what you got to do now is you'll consider this whole thing together. And when you consider this whole thing together, you can see the left side contains x minus 2. The right side also contains x minus 2. So I can say, I can take this x minus 2 out. If I take this x minus 2 away from here, what am I left with? I'm only left with 2x. I can write down 2x here. From this term, if I take x minus 2 away, what am I left with? Just minus 5. And this is my answer. So this is the method of factorizing a quadratic equation. Now that we know how to factorize a given quadratic equation, the next step is about solving quadratic equations. But before we go ahead and look at how do we solve quadratic equations, the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, why do we solve quadratic equations? Consider the graph of equation y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. The graph of this equation will have a shape like this. This is because the value of a in our case is positive. If it was minus a, then the shape of this graph would have been upside down, or I can say sad face. The equation that we have here is in terms of x and y. So I can say in this case, here's a line representing my x-axis. And I'll say here is a line representing y-axis. Now if you look at it carefully, you will notice that this curve crosses the x-axis at two locations. I'm going to call this one x1 and I'll call this one x2. So the first reason for solving this quadratic equation will be to determine the values of x1 and x2. In other words, I can say we solve quadratic equations to determine the values of x for which value of y is 0. If you look at this curve, there's one more point of interest, and that is this section here. We call this one turning point. And this is the second reason for solving quadratic equations. We solve quadratic equations to determine the coordinates of turning point. I'll call x and y for that. So our discussion concludes that we solve quadratic equations for two purposes. Number one is to find the values of x for which the value of y is 0. And the second purpose is to determine the coordinates of the turning point. Now let us consider how do we solve quadratic equations. So when it comes to solving quadratic equations, we have three different methods available to us. The method one is called factorization. So you will have to factorize the given quadratic equation and then you will be able to work out the value of x1 and x2. Method two is using quadratic formula. The third method is completing the square method. Method 1, which is factorization, is used to determine the values of x1 and x2. You will use quadratic formula again to work out the value of x1 and x2. But method 3 can be used to determine the values of x1 and x2, plus it can also be used to determine the coordinates of turning point, which are x, comma. So let's consider method 1, which is factorization. To make the process easy and understandable, I will use one quadratic equation and I will solve that one quadratic equation using all three methods. The equation that I'm going to use is y equals 2x squared minus 9x plus 10. So when I use method 1, which is factorization, I will say my equation will now transform into 2x squared minus 9x plus 10 equals 0. What does this mean? This means the question is asking us to find the values of x for which y has a value of 0, because I replaced y with 0 here. So means find values of x for which y equals 0. Now, because we are using method of factorization, I would like you to go back in the video and see this section where I factorized this equation and I got to this answer. So I'm not going to do this whole work again because it's the same question which is now being used for solving quadratic equations. So the step 1 will be you will factorize this. So step 1 will be factorize equation. If you factorize the equation, you will end up with your answer being x minus 2 times 2x minus 5 equals 0. From this point onward, what you will do is you will separate them out and you will say the first bracket x minus 2 is equal to 0 and the second bracket is also equal to 0. And then you will solve this to find the value of x. In other words, I can say following this, you will make x your subject here first. If you make x your subject, you will end up with your answer being x equals 2. This is the first value. I'll call it x1. If you make x your subject here, you'll have to follow the steps. First, you take this minus 5 to the other side. It will become 2x equals 5. Now to get rid of this 2, you will divide both sides by 2 and it will give you answer as x equals 5 over 2. And I'll call this one x2. So this is the method of factorization to solve quadratic equations. Step 1 will always be factorizing quadratic equation. And for that, we'll use this method, which we have discussed previously. Following that, once you have factorized it, You will then equate each bracket to 0 and you will make x your subject and you will end up with two values of x. Once I've got the values of x1 and x2, I can use this information to sketch a graph of this equation. Ax squared plus bx plus c. That's the quadratic equation, the generalized form of quadratic equations. Comparing these two equations reveals that a has a value which is positive. So this means the shape of the graph will be a smiley face or U. I can use this as a fact and I can then sketch a graph. So if I was to sketch a graph, we'll have a shape like this. I can then draw a line here. This is the line that is representing x-axis. In other words, this is line representing y equals 0. Then here, I can put down my values which I've calculated here. 2 is smaller, 5 over 2 is bigger, so I can say this will be my x1 as 2 and x2 as 2.5, or you can say 5 over 2. The second method of solving quadratic equations is by using quadratic formula. So when it comes to quadratic formula, you'll have to memorize this equation. Equation says x equals minus in bracket b plus minus in bracket b and then square minus 4 in bracket a in bracket c square root of this term divided by 2 times a. I do recommend that you use brackets in this formula. This is to ensure that you don't make errors when it comes to multiplying signs. So let's consider this question. It's the same question which we have solved using factorization method, but this time we will apply quadratic formula to work out the two values of x for which the value of y is 0. Because it says here solve, this means y now will be replaced with 0. So my equation will transform into 2x squared minus 9x plus 10 equals 0. Step 2 will be, I will rewrite my quadratic formula, which is generalized version, ax squared plus bx plus c. And I'm now going to work out the value of a, b and c by doing a comparison between them two. So it turns out that a has a value of plus 2, b has a value of minus 9, c has a value of plus 10. If you look at it, I have used signs with these. I do recommend that you do this as well because this will avoid making mistakes when you are solving these type of questions using quadratic formula. Once you've identified these values, all you have to do is you'll plug these values into this formula. So substitution will play an important part here. So I can now say it will transform into x equals minus, in bracket I can write down minus 9 plus minus square root. Instead of b, I will again write down minus 9 in bracket square on top minus 4 in bracket. Instead of a, I will write down plus 2, and instead of c, I will write down plus 10 over 2 times, instead of a, I will write down plus 2. Once you've done this, all you have to do is simplify it. Minus times minus 9 will change into plus 9 plus minus square root. Minus 9 squared will be 81. If you multiply these three numbers, 4 times 2 is 8 times 10 is 80. Work out the sign here. Multiply minus with plus, that gives you minus. And then you multiply minus with plus, that gives you minus again. And that means the sign here will be negative. Divided by, multiply 2 with plus 2, that will give you 4. And then keep this as plus 9 plus minus square root. 81 take away 80 will leave you with 1 over 4. Once you get to this stage, we can separate these two out. We will say our x1 will be plus 9 plus square root of 1 over 4. And my x2 will be plus 9 minus square root 1 over 4. So what I've done here is I had plus and minus here. So the first time I wrote this expression with only positive sign here. Second time I wrote the same expression with negative sign. Once you've got that, you just have to solve it. And if you solve it this time, you'll end up with x1 being equal to plus 9 plus 1 over 4. which is basically same as 5 over 2. This will be x2 equals plus 9 minus 1 over 4, which is same as x2 being equal to 2. Once I've got the two values of x, what I can now do is I can sketch the graph of this equation. And for that, I already know the value of a is positive, therefore it will be a smiley face. I've drawn a U shape and a line representing my x-axis. I can then say here are the two values of x, where this is x as 2 and this will be x as 5 over 2. So you can see now, last time we did the same question using factorization method and we had exactly the same two values for the x's. And our graph had the same shape as well. Our last method for solving quadratic equations is called completing the square method. Now recall, this method is used for two purposes. One is to find the values of x for which value of y is 0. So I can write down here to find the value of x1 and value of x2 for which y has a value of 0. And the second purpose of using this method is to find turning point coordinates. X and y. Now before we look into this method and see how we make use of this method to find the requested information, I would like to ask you to quickly expand this expression. Now I know from my experience, if I ask you to expand this expression, some students will write it down twice and then they will expand the brackets. And when you expand the brackets, you will end up with a squared plus ab plus ab plus b squared. And that will give you a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Now in my case, what I will do is I will make use of this and this to write down a generalized formula to expand expressions like these. So I can say, in this case, a has a sign that is plus, b also has a sign that is plus. If I'm asked to expand this, I can straight away use this and I can say, I will take square of the first term, which is this. Then I will put 2 always. I'll multiply this 2 with the first term and then I'll multiply it with the second term. And then I will add square of the second term. Let's consider an example on this. Our example says expand minus x plus 3 whole squared. So I'm going to use this method. What I will do is I will write down square of the first term. Instead of a, I have minus x here. So I'll write down minus x to the power of 2 plus 2, the first term, which is minus x, times the second term, which is plus 3, and then I will add square of the second term. Now this is important for us because in this case the left side is equal to the right side. So if I'm given the left side, I can write down the right side for it, and if I'm given the right side, then I can write down the left side for it. And this is something that will be used on questions involving completing the square method for solving quadratic equations. We'll make use of this concept now to solve quadratic equations using completing the square method. Here's the question. The question says y equals 2x squared minus 9x plus 10. And the question says you have to transform this into this format. A times x plus b whole squared plus c. So in your exam, if the question says transform this into this format, it's an indicator that you have to use completing the square method. Or if the question says find the turning points of the quadratic equation, then also you'll have to use completing the square method, and we'll follow the same procedure. Once I've identified that I'm going to use completing the square method, you will need to recall, I'm going to rewrite this equation, y equals 2x squared minus 9x plus 10. Your focus will always be on the first two terms. So rather than saying first two terms, your focus will always be on a term containing x squared and a term containing x. You will not do anything to this 10 initially. Step number 2 will be, you will have to write this term as squared term. Now in this case, it is not written as squared term. For example, if it was only x squared, I could have written it as plus x to the power of 2. If it was 4x squared, I could have written it as plus 2x to the power of 2. But I can't write 2x squared as something to the power of 2. So what I will now need to do is, I will factorize this section. If you factorize it, you will end up with y equals 2 times x squared minus 9x over 2 plus 10. Again, look, I did not do anything to this 10. Once I've factorized it, the next step will be, you will need to convert this section to a plus b whole squared, meaning you'll have to convert these two terms into something like that. How do we do that? Let's have a look. Write down y equals 2, I'll put bigger. I'll write down x squared as this term. So I'll write down plus x to the power of 2. Then my understanding says I have to write down plus 2 always. And I know the first term in my case is plus x. I now need to find a second term such that when I expand this, I should get minus 9x over 2. What will that number be here? In my case, it will be 9 over 4. But it's not only going to be 9 over 4, it has to be minus 9 over 4 because we have minus 9x over 2 here. It's going to be minus 9 over 4. Once I've identified this here, what I will now do is, I will add square of this number and I'll also subtract square of this number. And then I'll close the bracket. And then I'll bring this 10 down. Now, I do want you to pay attention here, because if you pay attention to it, you will have noticed by now that this is basically equal to 0. So everything in this bracket is exactly same as everything in this bracket. So these two expressions are exactly the same. Before I move on, I'm going to remind you once more what I did here, because this is an important step. I'm putting stars here as well. What you do is you write down x squared as plus x to the power of 2, then plus 2. This will always be plus 2. The first term, which is x, I had to find this term myself such that when I multiply these three terms, I should get minus 9x over 2. So in my case, it turns out to be minus 9 over 4. Once I've determined this term, I will add square of this and I'll subtract square of this as well. And then I'll close the bracket and I'll add 10. Now, I will focus on these three terms. Now, this is same as this because we know the right side. We can write down these three terms in the form of this. We can write down these three terms in this form. My a is plus x, my b is minus 9 over 4. So if I do that, it will change into y equals 2 times plus x minus 9 over 4 whole squared. Everything that you see in the green circle has now been transformed into this form, and they are both equal. I'm still left with this. I can copy minus sign. If you simplify this, it will change to 81 over 16. and then you close the bracket and you bring this plus 10 down. Once you've done that, you now need to expand, and if you expand it, you will end up with 2 times x minus 9 over 4 squared minus, if you multiply 81 over 16 by 2, you will end up with 81 over 8 plus 10. Now the next bit that I need to do is I need to add them to. Be very careful. You're not adding 81 over 8 to 10. You're adding minus 81 over 8 to 10. Now I can't add the two terms. Why? Because the 10 has a denominator of 1. I'll need to change that denominator to 8. So I'll multiply this by 8. I'll multiply this by 8. Now I'm able to add the two terms together. So if I work out the answer, it will be 2 times x minus 9 over 4 whole squared, and it will be minus 1 over 8. Once I've got to this state, this is exactly same as a times x plus b squared plus c, and that's what the question said to us. You have to transform this equation into this format, and I have done that over here. Now from here I can work out the coordinates of the turning point. So this will be my y coordinate, so y will be equal to minus 1 over 8. To find the x coordinate, I'll do x minus 9 over 4 equals 0. This gives me x as 9 over 4. So if I want to write them down as a single coordinate, it will be 9 over 4 comma minus 1 over 8. It's always x and then y. This is for turning point coordinates. You have to remember, including sign, whatever is the c is your y value. X plus b will have to be equated to 0, and you make x your subject, and that will give you the x value. Now let's quickly have a look. How do we get the values of x for which y has a value of 0? To find the values of x for which y has a value of 0, we can copy this expression. This is y equals 2 times x minus 9 over 4 whole squared minus 1 over 8. So in this case, I'm saying find values of x for which y has a value of 0. In other words, I'm saying solve this equation. So if you are asked to solve this, you'll replace y with 0. It will become 0 equals 2 times x minus 9 over 4 squared minus 1 over 8. You will get it off this first. So you'll do plus 1 over 8 on both sides. This will cancel out. You're then left with 1 over 8 equals 2 times x minus 9 over 4 whole squared. Now, to get it off this 2, you'll divide this side by 2, and you'll divide this side by 2. So if you divide this side by 2, this is gone. Here you'll have to use key flip and change rule. So it will be 1 over 8 times 1 over 2 equals x minus 9 over 4 and square. If you simplify the left side, it will be 1 over 16 equals x minus 9 over 4 whole squared. Now to get it off this square, you'll take square root on both sides. When you take square root on both sides, you'll end up with plus minus 1 over 4 equals x minus 9 over 4. From here, I can now separate them out, and I can say 1 over 4 will be equal to x minus 9 over 4. I can say minus 1 over 4 will be equal to x minus 9 over 4. If you solve this, you'll have to do plus 9 over 4 here. We'll have to do plus 9 over 4 here. This will be gone. If you simplify the left side, it will change to 10 over 4 equals x, which is same as x equals 5 over 2. This is my x1. Here, what I'll do is I'll do exactly the same thing. Work out the value of this x, I'll do exactly the same thing. I'll do plus 9 over 4, plus 9 over 4. This will be cancelled out. Now I'm adding minus 1 to plus 9 over 4. They both have the same denominator. So if you add them two together, it will change to plus 8 over 4 equals x. And this means my x2 is plus 2. Although this time I used a different method, my answer is exactly the same. You can see the first time when we used factorization method, answers were the same, 2 and 5 over 2. We got 2 and 5 over 2. When we use quadratic formula, our answers were the same, 2 and 5 over 2. So regardless of the method that you use, your answer will always be the same. But when you use completing the square method, you'll have additional information. In addition to the values of x for which y equals 0, you will also get a coordinate for the turning point. So if I plot a graph this time, the graph will have a little bit more information. So if I was to plot the graph, my graph will still have the same shape. Here it will have a value of 2. Here it will have a value of 2.5, but I can now include the coordinates of the turning point, which we have worked out as x being 9 over 4 and the value of y being minus 1 over 8. Okay, this time our graph contains one additional piece of information. This is all that you need to know on solving quadratic equations. I hope you found this video useful. If you enjoyed it, remember to like, share and subscribe. Stay safe, keep learning, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.